If you just hang with us. There we go. Simon, if you'd like to introduce us and the topics, that would be great.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm having a slight trouble seeing myself on the screen here, so apologies for that, but great to see so many of you have logged in. My name is Simon Reed. I'm the Managing Director of Accountants for Sale, and myself, Sam and Emma are hopefully going to take you through what we hope will be a really informative and useful session all around the legal ramifications and process involved in buying and selling an accountancy practice.
So, yeah, as Simon said, my name's Sam Durling. I'm a solicitor at Ramsdens Solicitors. Emma and myself work in the corporate department and work together on a lot of transactions. I think really that the first thing, obviously, if any of you are looking at buying or selling accountancy practices, you obviously want to have a good rapport with the other side, confidence that the transaction is going to be beneficial for both parties. And that really starts off with your housekeeping and your documents that you have in place ready for when the transaction kicks off, whether it's the financial records of the company, the statutory registers, the filings at Companies House, whether you've got your employment contracts in place, pension documentation, just to show that the practice you are selling and running at the time or looking to buy has been run in a thorough manner, which I'm sure it has, regardless of those documents being in place. But it really does inject a bit of confidence, particularly in a buyer who doesn't know a great deal about the business that they're buying, that it has been run in a proper manner for the duration of the ownership of the sellers. You also want to, have in place a structure as to what's happening with the property that the business operates from. Have management accounts, so those accounts obviously that you all well know better than I, most likely, that go beyond on a monthly basis from the last set of statutory accounts filed at Companies House for everybody to see. And also, I did touch on it just very briefly, the statutory registers of the company. That is the definitive record of the company, so the shares, the shareholders, share certificates, appointments of director, resignations, secretaries, charges, everything from the incorporation of the company that's being sold to the date of completion. Now, a lot of people get confused as to why we can't just rely on the information at Companies House, and the plain and simple answer is that information at Companies House is accepted on trust by Companies House. So you can make filings that are completely incorrect, or your past solicitors may make filings that are incorrect, and it will be accepted by Companies House without being verified. Whereas the statutory registers of the company should be verified by the directors of the company at the time that have the responsibility, directors' duties and responsibilities for the company during their appointment. So that really is the first stage before appointing solicitors, before drawing up all the documents. Your exit planning is really make sure that those documents are in place so that when a seller does want to sell, or when a buyer approaches you, you have that information ready to go, which will really ease through that initial process of negotiations and create that air of confidence to kickstart the transaction and make sure it goes smoothly.
Thank you. I'm not
Fantastic.
sure Simon. Oh, Simon's there.
Yeah.
Sorry,
You with us, Simon?
I seem to be unable of all the times to be able to turn my camera on, so no one can see my handsome face. But thank you for that, Sam. So once you've got your sort of documents in order, and you've hopefully agreed on a price, what options do sellers have on how to exit?
There's three main options, which you may or may not have come across them all. The most common, of course, is a trade sale, often a higher price for the seller. First type of option that often is looked at. That's mostly considered if there isn't a management team in place, an obvious opportunity for succession. Although there can be increased legal costs and increased accountancy costs for the due diligence which happens beforehand. If you have a third party at arm's length basis, of course, they don't know anything about the business. And also it could potentially end in a slight culture change for the business and the employees going forward. So it's important, and Simon will know. Oh, there he is. Thank you.
I've
Hi,
appeared.
Simon.
I am
Nice to
sorry.
see you.
Simon.
Nice to see you.
I'm of a certain age where I still find technology challenging.
That's all.
Of
But Simon
all
will
the time.
know. It's all important, isn't it, Simon, for seller and a potential purchaser to be brokered in a successful way, that they're a good match, because the succession there, the employees, a buyer wants to come in and have the same kind of outlook, and that there isn't massive changes, and they've got the common goals, and obviously you will see that day in, day out. We may or may not see that at the outset. We might see it a bit later on. Trade sale, different ways of doing a trade sale then is either a share sale or an asset sale. Now, with accountancy practices, we've dealt with both. We've dealt with incorporated accountancy practices that have sold their shares, and also accountancy practices that sold their assets. There's various reasons why they may or may want to do that. Selling shares, it all goes lock, stock and barrel, or the liabilities as well. So it's heavier due diligence for the buyer to undertake. But the seller can then walk away afterwards. If the assets are selling, we've got to look at 2P, and we've got to make sure that we undertake that procedure with the employees. And that potentially is a better situation for buyers, because they get to cherry pick and put a ring fence around the assets that they're purchasing. But it's all up for negotiation. Usually sellers most often want to sell shares, buyers want to buy assets. So if Simon comes in and you intermediary and help put that together, there might be other elements involved as well, but you're looking at what agreement can be made. It also depends on how much seller needs to get out, wants to, or what position the buyer's in as well, and what their position looks like initially. Could be first time, could be putting them into a group. So lots of variance there. Mentioning management buyout. Again, shares are assets. So if you've got partners, associates, people in your team already that are potentially the next generation, they are the obvious choice. We need to look at their funding. We need to make sure that there's either money in the business or money can come third party through a lender for a management team to come through. But that is obvious, and I think you will all know when you come to that point, you're looking at your team, you're looking at who potentially will be able to bring that on. Also, it's great for sellers to have that team that are coming through, because they've worked with them over the years, all the staff know them, and everybody will assume some sort of natural succession. But obviously, it's with their agreement that that's actually what they want to do, that they want to be the owners and bosses after all, and not just at managerial level. So it does depend, and we've done both. We've looked after sellers who have had succession there, may or may not then have worked out, and they've had to go to a third party trade sale afterwards. But it's always really positive. And management buyouts, when you're all on the same page, they practically know everything about the in and outs of the business. The due diligence is less, therefore, going forward, and it's more to do with the funding. They might want to pay out the sellers all on day one if they can, or there's most often we look at deferred consideration, because they can sort of get so much funding and pay them over time. And because they know who they are as well, it's different than having deferred consideration with a third party that they're not really sure of or know of. Third, which is becoming more and more popular, which no doubt you will have all heard about, employee ownership trusts. EOTs is known as well. Sellers will then sell their shares to a trust in an incorporated company. It is attractive to sellers, but it can produce some challenges going forward in terms of governance. So this needs to be really carefully looked at. The benefit goes into the trust, and then it benefits all the employees. The purpose is to preserve the business going forward. And this will happen, and it allows sellers to extract cash from the company tax-free on completion, provided that certain criteria are met. Employees can then have tax-free bonuses up to the amount of £3,600 to all employees, and can have a management team on a different level. For example, they do not have to pay the same amount in. Usually seller retains some percentage of the shares in order to sort of stay on in the early days, and that often works because they are still retained within the business and the goodwill. That's important as well. It's not an obvious management team like the one we talked about before, so we do really need the goodwill of the owners to sort of stay if possible. And then the trust benefits and the hard work of the management team, which is different to the MBO, in which the team benefits itself. So all employees benefit, not just management team. There's extra governance. We've got an extra trust there with a board of trustees, so we need to look at that. But it is more and more popular. It's been used quite a lot, and it's something to consider when we're looking at trade sales and management buyouts. EOTs are definitely something to look at the table. That's a possibility. Reduced legal fees, lack of due diligence, shorter documents. So that's really important to think about as well.
I mean, the legal fees that we experience, just to put a price on that, you're probably looking at half the legal fees for an employee ownership trust as opposed to a trade sale, together with those tax-free benefits of extracting the cash for the sellers. But the difference is the sellers don't receive as much on the sale, and they're still kind of involved in the business. So it really does depend on what the seller wants. Do they want to get out and retire and take the cash and that's it, or is it more of a succession planning for the business? So there are options there to facilitate different wants and needs, particularly for sellers in their exit.
I think one of the other things with the EOT option that's quite important is that the seller doesn't fall for the temptation to perhaps overvalue the business, which can be one of the major stumbling blocks. And I know from people I know that sort of specialize in the sort of EOT space that often sometimes sellers can maybe not have the right motivations to enter into an EOT. The tax benefits are obviously very attractive. There is a potential to sort of almost set it up and overvalue the business in such a way that the employees ultimately never do own the business, and it can then fall down. So there has to be a balance in terms of it has to be a mutual benefit for the employees as well as for the seller. And that's really important. And I think going back to your previous points, Emma, just in terms of the sort of different options, trade sale, management buyout, one thing that sort of comes out of that, and when we're talking about staff and trooping of staff across, it's all in the planning and preparation at the beginning, in terms of really understanding where you're at with your staff, where you're at with your employment contracts. And as much as we always say it's so important to get quality legal advice early on, in order for things to go smoothly, it's equally important to make sure that your HR function, if you haven't got one, to utilize an external freelance HR expert to come in, review all of those contracts, and make sure that you're well set up to TUPE those staff across. And as I always say, again, perhaps whilst you inevitably want to try and keep things confidential, you've at some point got to decide which of your key staff you're going to confide in and hopefully bring them along on the journey. So that's really important.
Also, with the TUPEing the staff across as well, it's identifying with your potential purchasers whether they are going to take any measures. So they may intend to just take the business on as it is and retain it and perhaps not make any changes immediately. Or you might have a buyer that is a bigger group. They already know that they've got key people in place, therefore they won't need certain members or area of that business. And that's really key. So you'll have that different, won't you, Simon, every time you look at different buyers. So we've looked at accountancy sales when an existing accountancy practice is buying one other because they're retiring and they're just going to merge it and they want to run it as it is. They might intend to move them into their building eventually, or they might be happy with the strategic position of that building and the goodwill and that other accountancy practice, keep it where it is. Or you could have one, and we did, where we sold a smaller accountancy practice into a larger group. So the larger group had different payroll and HR functions that they wanted it all to feed into. So there were members of staff that potentially undertook work that they weren't necessary for them going forward. So it's really important when you're looking at your buyer what their proposals are, because that will look at what measures they want to take, and that will affect the TP process as well. So we know we can talk about it generally, but as we all know, and I'm sure the delegates watching today will know, that it will depend on the identity and the intention of the buyer as well. So we talked about structure, we talked about whether you're selling shares or assets, so you might not be incorporated, so it's an asset sale anyway. But it's just making sure everybody realizes what we're doing, and when you're sort of driving it, looking at your tax position, what's best for you, what other options do you have? Are you retaining some of the business? Do you have more than one office? Are you wanting to sort of hive one to one side? So it depends, and equally the buyers will look as well what's best for them. So they might want to do an asset purchase because that's best for their for their tax position as well. So it's that negotiation and identifying it. And sometimes we get a deal agreed, and that everybody said, well, this is the deal we've made, and we've looked at it and thought, well, if we'd spoke to them a little bit earlier, we would have put some suggestions in front of them that would have made a different end result possibly. So we really like to be involved as early as possible, and involved in heads of terms is really important. And quite often accountancy to accountancy, quite capable, more than capable of putting some heads of terms together between the two. They might have been acting for other clients that are doing similar sort of deals, so they're quite used to putting heads of terms together. But that is something we do assist in. Either potentially they've looked at a draft between the two of them and they want us to go through it before it's signed off. Obviously, heads of terms are not legally binding, they're an intention, but we all feel that once people put certain key provisions in heads, if anybody then wants to stray too far away from it, then the goodwill of where your intentions are in the deal change. So well-prepared heads can prevent prolonged negotiations, and we can help the main transactional documents along a lot quicker, especially if we know that they've been well thought out, well prepared, agreed, they detail quite a lot of what we then need to put into the main transactional documents. It might be a share purchase agreement or asset purchase agreement. And then we can let the seller and buyer look at some of the commercial terms, talk about employees, etc., and lawyers can get on, and it takes that stress away. So a lot of the deal is agreed up front. Well structures can provide them the comfort as well that once they've instructed solicitors, we're doing due diligence, we're getting on with things, that they know that substantive terms have been agreed, that they know which way we're heading. There's no sort of shocks or twists or turns. And it can also discuss in the heads the pricing structure, which every seller is going to want to know, are they getting all the cash on day one, or is that not possible? Does the buyer want to pay so much? Are we going to have completion accounts? We're going to have a lockbox, financial reasons, funding reasons. Are they only able to borrow so much? If that's the case, do we want to take in the security as seller? All these kind of things that need to be looked at the beginning, put in heads of terms. Quite often they want the sellers to remain, especially the goodwill is with the partners of the practice. They may be looking to retire, they may have been there a very long time. So heads might sort of say, once we've completed, we'd like you to stay with us 6 months, 12 months. They might be asked to enter into a consultancy agreement. They might reduce hours, but they're there to help the transition with the new buyers coming in and the staff and the clients as well, to make all those introductions. We give confidentiality in the heads of terms, goes without saying. Once you start talking about things, you realise some things are out there. And you might agree an exclusive term as well. So potentially there might discuss this with other buyers, but buyers often want to know if they're taking time and money instructing professionals to assist with this. They might be doing surveys of buildings, things like that, that they might have a period of exclusivity. So the seller agrees not to talk to anybody else for a set amount of time to see if they can get under contract within a few months. But that really does give you a grounding, really, with the heads of terms, that everybody knows exactly where you're at.
They're so important. They really are. And if they're set out well at the beginning, and you guys, of course, any clients that come to you at an early stage, you can give them a good example working document and give them a good understanding of what to include early, the things to avoid, because I often find that heads of terms, when they end up in front of a legal professional, often then have to be unravelled. And as you've already said, so often, you know, it then becomes, it's the old adage of it's a lot harder to ski uphill, and that's what can really add time to the deal process. And as we always say, time kills deals. So I think, you know, if you get heads of terms, whilst they're not legally binding, if they're well constructed, well put out, well put together, and they really reflect what's been discussed between the two parties, and they're comprehensive and they cover all the elements, the property, the staff, the business itself, the financials, if it's all clear, then moving through the process afterwards is it's very, very much easier.
Of course, you can include NDA non-disclosure agreement within the heads or separately as a standalone document. It just ensures that we all know that the kind of information we're sharing between one another, and it could go both ways as well. It could go with the buyer, couldn't it? They're talking about their key staff and who might be coming across as well. I mean, it's difficult once you get to the stages where potentially they want to look at a bit more information, but you're not under contract, of course, until you've exchanged contracts, either party can back out. But what we tend to do is we'll wait until we get almost close to the point of exchange of contracts before we start to give the kind of detail that we want to say. But that's when it's imminent. I think Simon's just frozen. You can.
He has indeed.
Oh,
You got me.
You're still there, Simon. I
am. Can you see and hear me? I think my screen seems to be bringing up different screens and all sorts this morning.
We've got a screenshot of you. There you go. You're back.
I'm back. Yeah,
but yeah,
I should have done more due diligence with my IT supplier, I think.
Well, taking us on to due diligence, but once we've gone through heads of terms, if an NDA has been signed, that is the next stage in the transaction. So again, given the industry that all the delegates that are listening in work in, I'm sure that they've come across due diligence before, but it really is the buyer's opportunity to find out everything they want to know about the business or shares that they are buying before they put pen to paper, essentially to identify any skeletons in the closet, whether it's current litigation proceedings, vicarious liability for an employee, previous issues which have since been settled, but wanting evidence to show that has been settled and the settlement paid, looking at the employment contracts, looking at the commercial contracts as well, looking at the accounts, those statutory books that we mentioned previously, health and safety, licenses, consents, environmental, property lease, all of this that the buyer will want to know before they put pen to paper, and that is a long process. Sometimes it's not as long as it can be. You know, it could be a couple of weeks. You could have a back and forth where you respond to due diligence inquiries, and that results in a follow-up question because the buyer's just not quite sure that they've got everything that they need to tick that box. So we do step in at that point quite heavily, because at the end of the day, the sellers have got to run their business whilst dealing with all of these inquiries, which is an incredibly stressful period. And having us manage that data room, the online data room where documents are uploaded, and holding their hands and really explaining why we're going through this and managing the process does help speed it up. So we do get heavily involved in those due diligence inquiries and are often asked by sellers to assist in that, because it's simply too time intensive for them to deal with on their own whilst running the business. At the end of the day, if you're spending so much time on the due diligence inquiries and not running the business, it could harm the business that you're trying to sell. That causes an issue in itself. So we do try and work together with clients to make sure that it's streamlined and efficient and dealt with promptly, because without that, the buyer won't put pen to paper.
But also, don't you think, over the years, we've dealt with due diligence in many different ways. So before we had electronic data rooms, we would have copy documents.
We'd have a Bible.
We'd have physical folders of documents, and we would redact personal details and employment contracts, so we're not breaking any data protection regulations there. But now, of course, we've got online data rooms. We've had them for some time. Once they're uploaded there, they're visible for everyone to see at a click of a button, not by copying bundles and posting out. But equally, we've dealt with some accountancy practices that do work a little bit differently, and they might not be wanting to use a data room. So we've also worked with them on that basis as well. So we will work with the client as to what's best for them. We're not saying this is the way you do it. We can let them know best practice and the ways to make it easy for them. But equally, currently, with an accountancy practice, they're local to one another and they have met with one another and they're looking at documents between the two of them. So there's different ways we can do it, and we'll just discuss those options with the clients in turn.
Sorry, Sam.
I think what's also important is we'll move on to the disclosure process, but those responses to inquiries will be disclosed as a term under the agreement, which means that it protects a breach of warranty claim. So making sure that those responses to inquiries are prepared properly and cover all aspects that they need to really does protect the sellers, as well as inform the buyers of what they're getting, what they're buying.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it goes back to your pre-sale preparation, preparing a business for sale, that I know we've done quite a bit of work on recently with the ACCA, and produced some different articles on what are the steps. And a lot of them are very basic things. But in the course of running your business day to day as a busy accountant, trying to keep all your clients happy, keep your staff happy, and deal with 1,000 things, it's really difficult sometimes to step back and be able to do that. But with the due diligence, again, most of the due diligence questions that you're going to get asked as a seller are fairly standard and fairly typical. But if you've got a sort of written working document that you can work through like a checklist almost, then you can get so much of this ready so that your business is prepared for sale and that your business is ready for due diligence. And getting ready for due diligence is a really good exercise in any event. It's a bit like a health check on your business.
It is.
And if you do this well in advance and well before you sort of go to market, you're far likely to have a much smoother sale process. Your legal fees, dare I say, will be reduced because of the time spent, and ultimately it will mean that you're likely to hopefully potentially get a stronger, better price, because you've ironed out any of the wrinkles and dealt with any potential issues or stumbling blocks. And it's worth pointing out again that any buyer, and quality, genuine buyers are very keen to buy good businesses at the moment. They're not specifically looking for things to trip you up on. Probably the opposite. They don't want to discover things in the due diligence process that are going to be a disappointment or make them question their decision to buy your business. If they've made an indicative formal offer, they don't want to go back on that. if they can avoid it. So, you know, again, it's really about preparation, looking at your business and getting professional help at an early stage.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I think a lot sometimes when a seller is selling for the first time, they feel that when due diligence goes on and on and on, it's almost an attack on their business that they've made, and it's not. It's just it's they really don't want to find anything, but until you ask the question, you don't know. That's the entire point behind it, and that then feeds into the disclosure process that I mentioned. So from the due diligence inquiries, an agreement, either an asset purchase agreement or a share purchase agreement, will be drafted, and then a disclosure letter will be prepared to qualify the contractual promises within that agreement, so that if there are any issues, if there are any promises within that agreement that the sellers can't make, they then disclose that in this disclosure letter. And if it is properly disclosed, together with all the supporting documents that have been provided in the online data room and circulated between the parties and their advisors, then the buyer can't make a claim against that, because they've been informed of the issue that they have asked a promise about. So it really feeds into that protection for the sellers, whilst also informing the buyer about what they're purchasing.
In your experience, Sam, within the disclosure letter, what kind of things typically can come up?
I would say usually statutory registers that I mentioned at the beginning, and I don't want to harp on about that, but we've had many of those where they've not been written up, or there have been incorrect filings, issues relating to the employees, whether or not there's been some disputes between employees, if there's been improper conduct, not having certain documents in place. Now, in terms of accountancy practices, that's probably not as big a thing, but if you're in the manufacturing business, for example, have you got the proper licenses to carry out the job that you're doing? Different contracts in terms of waste disposal. Have you got an HR company supporting you? Can you show that your pensions you've paid your pension obligations up to date? If the employees aren't signed up to a pension, have they provided a pension opt-out letter that they're legally required to? Property issues, if there's a covenant over the property that's not been adhered to, all of these kind of things. So there are numerous issues that could arise, but it is all on a given basis. You could have a disclosure letter that's 10 pages long, because there's such a long history of the company that there are inevitably some historic issues. Or you might have a disclosure letter that's 3 pages long. It really does vary as to what could be included in those.
But it's worth pointing out, I think, as well here, is that when these warranties are given within the share purchase or an asset purchase agreement, we would put a time limit on those and a financial cap, and also a financial amount that need to reach before a buyer can make a claim, so that it doesn't go on forever. But so, for instance, you know, within 12 to 18 months, anything that possibly would come out that wasn't obvious on the
post completion,
post completion,
then
there will be a limit, so sellers aren't on the hook waiting forever. That there is a time that comes to an end. But it's also industry specific, isn't it, as well? So with accountancy practices, the minimal licenses, mostly employment issues, because it's just, you know, do you outsource any tax work or payroll, anything that's outsourced, any contractual liabilities buyers want to know about. They want to see if that's in writing. It might not, you might be out of contract and you've just carried on working that way. Also, they might want to rely on that going forward, so they want to say that that third-party provider is still going to provide it post-completion, so they might want that affirmed in writing that this is the case.
IT issues as well, IT systems, you know, security, that is a big a big issue for industries like ourselves, solicitors, accountants. We rely heavily on technology instead of manpower, So that crops up quite a lot as well.
Things like cybersecurity essentials, again,
Yeah.
if you're a bigger business and you've got a lot of data, a lot of clients, being able to demonstrate that you've got really robust processes in place, that you're compliant and your data is secure, that again is all going to help with the due diligence process, and it's going to help with the attractiveness of your business. Do you want to just talk about the sort of ins and outs of the share purchase agreement, asset purchase agreement, and because that's obviously a key transactional document, what sort of is in that, what it is, what it means?
Yeah, absolutely. So at the beginning of the document, you'll have the parties, the definitions, the background information on what you're planning to happen, what's being purchased, when it's being paid for, is there going to be deferred consideration? If there is deferred consideration, is it secured? Is it secured by a debenture? Is it secured by a share charge? If it's not, what mechanism do the sellers have to ensure that deferred consideration is paid? So if there's an event of insolvency, for example, of the buyer, we would make sure that there was some contractual provisions in there to make sure that the sellers could request the deferred consideration on demand should an insolvency proceedings be issued. How the price might be adjusted. So do you go for completion accounts? So accounts prepared as at the date of completion between the accountants. Fortunately, we're talking to a great many accountants who won't need to instruct anybody else to do that, but can agree it between themselves to define that final purchase price. Or do you go for a locked box account? So a purchase price agreed prior to completion, which obviously the sellers would prefer because it provides them with security as to what they're going to get paid. Whether or not there's anything within the lockbox provisions that prevents the sellers from undertaking certain actions that could cause a leakage between the locked box date and the completion date. So are they allowed to take dividends, for example? The sellers would probably not want them to, because that could be quite a lot of money that's leaving the business. The warranties that we've mentioned in there, both general warranties in relation to the business and tax warranties. Any indemnities would be heavily looked at as well. So if there's any issues that have arisen out of due diligence that require the buyer requires specific protection on a pound for pound basis, regardless of no requirement to mitigate those costs involved in rectifying those issues, those would be very specifically and tightly drafted to make sure that the sellers aren't on the hook forever and ever and essentially writing a blank check. We want to make sure that that's not the case. So the share purchase or asset purchase agreement essentially sets out what's being bought and sold, how it's being paid for and when, and all of the other issues, other aspects, including the warranties, both general and tax, that are associated with the business that's being purchased.
I think what we've found as well, Simon, over the years is that accountants we've worked with, they have seen share purchase and asset purchase agreements for their clients. I've seen that it feels very different for them when it's their agreement and you're looking at it for you and your own business. They will have obviously been in the past may have looked at accounting and tax warranties in an agreement, or looked at pricing mechanisms or completion accounts, or worked through completion accounts with their clients. So they will have been asked, no doubt, numerous times to look at these provisions to give that advice through to seller and the seller solicitor. But then of course it always feels a bit different when it's them. And it's just taking the time to go through it, and we don't assume that everybody, you've seen it before, so you know how this works. We do know it feels very different when it's your business that you're selling, and it's the one time that you get to sell it. You want it to be right, you want everyone to be happy, you want to come away with what you want to come away with. And then we'll help you support you through that. Commercially, we can let you have a feel for how things are going along, but that's what we're here to do, to support.
Absolutely.
What about the sort of funding from a buyer's perspective in terms of what you can do there? to hopefully give the seller the peace of mind within that. I think we've sort of touched on it a bit, but in terms of what the if there's money being lent, if the buyer is borrowing money, you can help with that as well, I think, can't you?
Absolutely. So it really depends on when the lending's coming from. So if it's a management buyout, you might have some loan notes being issued from the seller to the buyer to fund the purchase. They might want those to be secured by a debenture between the parties, essentially loaning the monies on completion to fund the purchase. You might have, if we're acting for buyer, the buyer might go to a high street lender. They might go to HSBC. They might go to Barclays, where there's a full suite, a security package with debentures over the buyer, the target, guarantees, personal guarantees from the individuals buying as well. So that needs to be heavily advised on. Obviously, the ramifications of not complying with a personal guarantee are quite severe. So we can look at those security packages and report to the client on them. If it's a security package between the parties directly, they are often heavily negotiable, so the terms within the debenture can be amended. If you're looking at a security package from a third party lender, it's more a case of reporting to the client on the ramifications of the document, as opposed to this needs changing. This needs to be changed because Barclays won't listen to any of that. If they're lending you money, then the document is the document. It's almost a take it or leave it situation. But we do provide advice and report and amend documents in relation to the security of that funding, whoever it's from.
And of course, if you're brokering an agreement with the seller, potential buyers, and they need third party lending, but they can't pay it all on completion, and they ask a seller, to allow them to have some deferred. Well, there's less likelihood for the sellers to have any security because there's already a bank involved, so they'd fall behind the bank anyway. So when you're putting these parties together, that's all important, isn't it? Because the seller needs to know, if I am allowing deferred, can I get any security? It might not be possible. So all of those things are important. Usually buyers, will know where the figures are at the outset, so sellers know exactly what they're looking at when they're agreeing to the offer.
Yeah. And then really at the end of all that, once the disclosure letter has been agreed, the due diligence has been completed, the transaction agreement has been agreed and signed, all the ancillary, so the board minutes, the resolution of the shareholders, the company's house filings have been agreed and signed and dated, and the money's been transferred, we then go back to a similar point as what we mentioned at the beginning about keeping your documents up to date, on record. Make sure your filings at Companies House are made at completion, that we're more than happy to undertake. Make sure those statutory records are updated to show the new shareholders. Make sure that the directors that have been appointed for the target company have been appointed properly. Make sure that's updated in the statutory registers. Make sure all the records of the company have been transferred to the buyer, so the records about the accounts, the employment contracts, the pension provisions, the leases, if there are any, over the property. Make sure all of that's handed over so that the buyer can then run the company and the business from completion in a manner in which it most likely, hopefully, will have been carried out before completion as well. So it's just making sure that once the transaction's completed, you start on the right foot, in the same way that when the transaction starts, you want to start on the right foot in the same way.
Absolutely, and the buyer and the seller have obviously both got a vested interest in ensuring that the clients are going to continue to be looked after, and that they are hopefully sort of front and centre. And the buyer, certainly, having just bought this business, will hopefully want to treat it with care, sure that they do look after those clients, and not having to spend time picking up on bits and pieces and loose ends,
Yeah.
is really important. So if the sale process and the whole negotiation process it has been done well, then ultimately it's a client that will benefit, hopefully.
Yeah. And then last thing probably is not something that we would advise on, but obviously for sellers that had an influx of cash, they probably want to look at some inheritance tax planning or investment planning with these new funds that they've just acquired. So that's always something that at the end of the transaction, acting for sellers, we would always advise them to go and take independent advice on that point to make sure that their finances are updated and being managed properly in a tax efficient way.
It's a nice problem to have.
It is not a problem that we have.
Well, hopefully, I mean, having gone through that whole process and you've got the money in the bank and you're drinking the champagne.
Exactly.
As you say, there's always a sting in the tail potentially, and trying to ensure that you plan your tax affairs efficiently is obviously important. It's a whole new conversation, isn't it? And as you say, again, it's just worth taking the time to get professional advice and to plan in advance and to think ahead. As all of the accountants on this webinar now will, work with their clients to try and minimise their tax liabilities. They've got to they need to obviously do the same for themselves. But I think in essence, it goes back to the very beginning we were talking about, preparation and planning, getting your ducks in a row, and decide, working out what it is you want to try and achieve, and then you can get things structured and put together in such a way that the process can flow very smoothly, and you can hopefully get a good outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had one question whilst we've been talking that I'm more than happy to deal with. In your experience, what are some red flags that buyers should watch out for during due diligence? It does depend on the business that's been acquired. In terms of accountancy practices, it will be, like we said, the IT security, cyber security, contracts of employment, pensions, property, and general commercial contracts, whether it's for IT services, telephones, computers, office equipment, leases, etc. When it comes to buying shares, regardless of the industry that the business operates in, are those share registers, because without that, you don't actually know that the person you're buying off actually owns the shares you're buying, which is a very scary thought for people that are putting a lot of money, transferring a lot of money over. So the registers are incredibly important, and we would always make sure that if they haven't been prepared and updated on an ongoing basis, they are reconstituted before completion to make, and then warranted as being true and accurate, to make sure that the buyers have got that protection, that they are actually buying from somebody that is able to sell what they are trying to buy.
And know that the delegates here will keep company books for their clients, update online and do electronic formats. And they will also have in their archives, like we do, all statutory registers from decades ago.
Yeah.
So we get a real mixture, which I'm sure all of your delegates will have seen. But really, it's fully documented. Everything's up to date. Is a good housekeeping tip. But we're very happy if anyone else has any questions.
I think we've just had another one
Oh.
just come up, and just on in terms of how to prepare your practice for sale, that's something I'm very happy to answer, and I've got some documents that I'll happily send out to you, for the person that just flagged up that question. By all means, drop me an email, and I can send you across some information on what are the things you should be looking at to prepare your practice. Going back to the previous question about red flags, Sam, you've obviously talked about some of the legal red flags. I think the other aspects within due diligence, again, are things like there's lots of things you'd look at in terms of the business to ascertain, do you really want to buy this business? One of them might be, you look at the client base, you perhaps look at the ages of the clients. If the seller is at retirement age, perhaps hasn't done much new business development for a number of years, it's possible that a lot of the clients are also of a certain age. You might have 40%, 30-40% say of the business is with one or two clients. Those again would be risk factors that you would need to look at closely. But those are sort of softer due diligence questions and things that you'll look at, not necessarily legal, but there's a lot of red flags. And again, for the person that asked that question, I'm very happy to share some information to give you hopefully give you a bit of a track to run on.
Equally with us, we'll share our email addresses, because we're quite conscious that you may be considering it. It's going to happen perhaps one day, or you are going through it right now, but we'd like to be on hand, to be the advisors, and commercially assist you through this as well. So we're not just there just to put documents in place at the end. We've got the wealth of experience within corporate team at Ramsdens to be able to do that, and we account for lots of sizes of accountancy practices. And it's been really good to work. It's really good to work with other professionals who, like I say, they've seen it for their clients time and time again, but to be able to be instrumental in when they actually come to buy and increase in size or to sell it's been really good work to do as well.
Absolutely. And we've also got property lawyers and employment lawyers here. So if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask in a more private state than on this webinar, they don't want to disclose any information that they're thinking about right now, we completely understand. But if it's not corporate related and it is more niche in terms of the employment aspects, we've got other colleagues that are very able and happy to answer any questions that they might have.
Absolutely. So we're going to do email addresses, were we? So do you want to go first, or?
Yeah, okay. So mine is sam.durling, that's DURLING @ramsdens.co.uk. Emma?
Mine's the same format, but emma.spragg, which is SPRAGG.
And I am Simon at accountantsforsale.co.uk. So very happy to answer any questions, any queries. One of the reasons for doing this webinar today is very much we're mindful it's a long-term process for people. But if you start 6 months, a year, 18 months in advance, you can make the process very much easier, and hopefully not be in a sort of panic when you get to the point where you perhaps need to sell. So planning is everything.
Yeah, absolutely is.
And thank you, Simon. It's been really good to share things with you as well over the past few weeks and to work closely with you.
No, it's brilliant. It's really
absolutely.
It's really good.
It is good to work with, like we said, different professionals, be it, buyers or sellers, and Simon plays a very key role in matching the parties and making sure it all runs smoothly. So
at the coalface.
Absolutely, even before we get involved.
Thank you everyone for attending.
Yes.
Thank you for your time, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining, and speak to you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.